We are now recording 110 Acoustics and Psychoacoustics, Unit 5. We are beginning Unit 5, our second unit in the Psychoacoustics section of this course. And today is April 2nd, 2019. So here we go. Unit 5 kind of continues from Unit 4. In Unit 4, we talked about hearing thresholds. We talked about method of limits. We talked about the Huson-Westlake ascending-descending procedure. And then we talked about, what else can I lie to you about? We talked about bias, false positives, false negatives, true positives, true negatives, all of that stuff. Then we went into DBHL because we talked about minimal audible field and minimal audible pressure. And minimal audible field was the softest it took to hear all the different frequencies with one ear under a headphone. And it says here, hi Ted, I wasn't able to see the notes for the Zoom session. Well, they should be in Unit 5. They really ought to be. I mean, here's what I can do. I'll share screen and I'll take a look-see myself. I'll just find out what's going on here. Let me just go into, I hate that black bar when it goes down there. I hate that thing. Go away. I wish it would go. I can't. Let's see if I can try to get into, well, why not just go to here? And let's see. No, that really won't do it either. It's that black tab. If I could make that thing go away, if I could drag it, oh yeah, I can. Beautiful. Okay, so let's go into Canvas here and see if it's in Canvas. Okay, here we are, pulling down, and we are in right here. Okay, pulling up, we've got our coursework, and I'll go into Unit 5. And let's see. You know what? You're entirely right. I can't see it either. I don't see anything in there. There's no notes in there. I have no reason, no idea why that is the case. But you are quite right. Well, here's what we'll do. I'll put them in after this Zoom session. I'll stick really closely to the notes. We'll make this Zoom session shorter than usual. We'll only go on 40-45 minutes tonight, okay? Because we're going to continue this unit next week. So right after or very soon after this Zoom session, I will upload the PowerPoint and the notes. Isn't that odd? They aren't here. You're quite right, Julie. I don't see them either. So that's no wonder. Okay, no worries. Because, well, if you follow me with the stuff we're doing now, you can always listen to the Zoom session a second time, which is what I always advise people to do anyway. But thank you very much for bringing that to my attention, because I never would have uploaded any notes. I thought they were just there from last year. So, okay, without any further ado, no worries there. Okay, that's Unit 5. We now know those truths to be self-evident. All right, good stuff. Here we are back at our notes again. And we're continuing from last time, and we talked about, let's see what we got here. No, I don't see anything there. Okay, so we talked about minimal audible field last time, and that's the softest it took to hear all the different frequencies with one ear under a headphone. And if we take a look in our PowerPoints here, we'll see minimal audible field right here as it's blown up. And this is straight out of last week's thing. See if I can lift that black bar and move it up now. Okay. All right. So here we have the softest level required to just barely hear all the different frequencies at 1 meter distance from a speaker with 2 ears. And you'll notice that 1000, we called that 0 dB SPL. And I'm just saying, and that what pressure was that against the eardrum? 0.0002 dynes per centimeter squared. And they called that pressure 0 dB sound pressure level. And when they play the same game at all the other frequencies, you'll end up with a curve. And some frequencies we even hear better than 0 dB SPL. So this was on minimal audible field, and then minimal audible pressure was playing the same game again, but with one ear under a headphone. And minimal audible pressure gave you a slightly higher curve, okay? Minimal audible pressure. Because one ear under a headphone isn't quite as good as 2 ears listening in front of a speaker. And 2 ears are about 5 dB better than 1. And then we said minimal audible pressure is 0 dB hearing level. And then we talked last week a bit about binaural hearing, why we have 2 ears. So today we continue now in Unit 5, and we're really going to be talking more about loudness and pitch. Loudness and pitch. Let's see where that takes us. We'll escape out of here, go to loudness and pitch, and we'll talk a little bit about this stuff. Loudness is the perception of intensity, okay? Pitch is the perception of, or I should say, yeah, pitch is the perception of frequency. See, loudness is the psychological counterpart to intensity. The scientist adjusts the intensity in dB SPL, and the person, the artsy-farts person says, oh, how loud was that? Okay, so loudness is the perception of intensity. Pitch is the perception of frequency. The scientist talks about frequency, the musician talks about pitch. Okay, so one's more of a science term and the other one's more of an artsy-farts term. And the artsy-farts term is psychoacoustics. Okay, and the physics term is more intensity and frequency. So the unit we use to measure intensity is dB SPL, or the unit we use to test hearing level in humans is dB hearing level. But loudness is something we measure in what we call phons. Loudness is measured in phons, P-H-O-N-S. And I'll show you pictures of them. Loudness is the psychoacoustic perceptual side for physical intensity. Loudness is shown in phon curves, also called equal loudness curves or Fletcher-Munson curves. So phons are the psychological unit measured to measure the sensation of loudness. And here's what else it says. Phon curves come from the resonances of your outer and middle ears. So if you look at our PowerPoint slide, this is minimal audible field. 0 phons. I'll pull it up here. Okay, let's go to our first slide. Minimal audible field. That's 0 phons. And let me articulate what we mean by that. 0 phons. I'll lift this thing. Yeah, now that black bar is really crazy. It's just driving me nuts. Let's see if we can pull it up more. See, these are called equal loudness contours on the top. Okay? If I put this guy way down here, maybe it won't bug you as much. Okay, 0 phons. So look at this here. Every frequency along this bottom curve, minimal audible field, is heard equally loud. How loud? Just barely audible. That's how loud, right? That's what minimal audible field represents. What's the softest intensity to just barely hear all the different frequencies with 2 ears in front of a speaker? So 1,000 hertz, we called that 0 dB SPL. And how loud is that? 0 phons. Okay, now 500 hertz. How intense did we need to make it to just barely hear? Well, probably about, if you follow my cursor, about maybe 7. So 7 dB SPL at 500 hertz is barely audible as well, isn't it? That's 0 phons too. Let's go to 200 hertz or 250. How intense did we need to make that to just barely hear that at 1 meter distance from a speaker with 2 ears? Oh, about 22 dBSPL. And how loud did we hear that 250 hertz tone? Just barely. Just like we heard here. Just barely. Just like we heard here. Just barely. Okay? So all 3 points are 0 fons. 100 hertz. We had to turn that up to about 40 dBSPL for that tone to be just barely audible. Okay? So how loud did we hear that tone? Just barely. So how loud was that? 0 fons. See, so every frequency along this curve is heard equally loud. How loud? Just barely audible. That's how loud. Threshold. So this is normal hearing thresholds for all the different frequencies with 2 ears in front of a speaker. And that minimal audible field, you can call that 0 fons. Because how loud is each frequency along the curve heard? They're all heard equally loud. How loud? Just barely. That's why they're called equal loudness contours. Now look at the top one. Crank up 1,000 hertz until it's like 120 dBSPL. That's loud. Now, I wouldn't want to undergo this experiment, but some people did. They memorized the loudness of 1,000 hertz at 120 dBSPL, and they called that 120 fons. And then they turned 500 hertz up to 100, and they said, tell me when that sounds just as loud as this one does. And they had to turn it up to about 122. And then they took 250 hertz and they turned that one up. Tell me when that sounds as loud as this one here. And it needed to be about 123 or 124. And then they took 100 hertz, cranked that up. Tell me when that sounds equally loud to this tone here at 120. And it needed to be here. So every frequency along this top curve is heard equally loud. How loud? Really loud. 120 fons. Okay? What's interesting is that the curve flattens out. As you get more intense, the curve flattens out. Look at this. People did all kinds of them. The bottom one is minimal audible field. And then they turned up 1,000 hertz to 10 dBSPL. And then they asked people to match all the other tones so they sounded equally loud. And then they turned 1,000 hertz up to 20 dBSPL. How loud was that? Okay, now they matched it, the loudness of other frequencies, and they made them, they found out the intensity required of all the other frequencies to sound equally loud to the 1,000 hertz tone at 20. So every frequency along the 20 curve is heard equally loud, and every frequency along the 40 curve is heard equally loud. And as you can go up, 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 you'll notice the curves flatten out. And this tells us something. I'm going to stop sharing for a second. This tells us about boom boxes, ghetto blasters, radios, okay, CD players. Have you ever noticed that a lot of them have what's called a loudness switch on them? A loudness switch? Or a bass boost. And that's for when the volume is soft. Because when the volume is soft, we need more dBSPL to hear all the frequencies equally loud. And we really got to boost up those bass frequencies. But when we crank up the intensity with the volume control, you don't need that bass boost anymore because of equal loudness contours. Look, when things are really soft, we've got to boost up the bass so that we can hear all the frequencies equally loud. When sounds are really loud, the bass doesn't need that boost for all the frequencies to sound equally loud. Weird, huh? So these are called equal loudness contours, or Fletcher-Munson curves, or just basic Fon curves. So now let's look at just our notes here for just a second. All right. And read what we just said. The curves actually result from various resonances of our outer and middle ears. Let's see if I can show a picture of that. Shit, whoops. Oh, gosh. Employee self-service home. See if I can close that here. Okay, share. Okay, let's see. Let's see if I can find that guy right here. Okay. Anyway, so here's what they call an equalizer. Let me just see something here, just to make sure we've got it all. Okay. Equal loudness. They come from the resonances of your outer and middle ears. Okay, that's what I'm just searching here to see if I had that slide, but I don't believe I do. I bet you any money though that I do have it from last week's one. So I'll just pull up last week's one, and I think it'll probably be in there. I'll bet you dollars to donuts it will be. So here we go, down here, down here. Whoa, I don't even think we had it there either, which is very unusual. Anyway, this curve, these curves, I'll close down this particular PowerPoint and leave the other one up, okay? The very fact that this is a curve, okay, this comes from the resonance of your outer ears and the resonances of your middle ears. Those two resonances give us the sweet spot right here. Okay, and actually minimal audible pressure it's actually, follow my cursor, it actually does this and has a little bulge here. And why does it have a little bulge here? It actually isn't just 5 dB completely above, it isn't quite like is drawn here. In all actuality, if you followed my cursor, it would kind of go like this. And then back to here. And you know why? Because minimal audible pressure, you're covering up your ear. And when you're covering up your ear, you lose the outer ear canal resonance because it's no longer a quarter wave resonator. It's no longer a tube open at one end and closed at the other. You've closed it off with a headphone. So you've lost some of the contribution of the outer ear. Okay? So the MAP curve actually goes, follow my cursor, much like this, and then has a little bit of a bulge here. And then goes to here. All right, but at any rate, so when we're looking at our notes here, the curves come from the resonances of the outer and middle ears. And all points on any one curve show the relative intensity in dBSPL that it takes to hear all the different frequencies equally loud. The curves show that there's a difference between loudness and intensity. Otherwise, they wouldn't be curves. Think about it. Okay, it would all be flat. There's a difference between loudness and intensity. Again, let's just pick some curve, and I like to pick on this one here. Let's look at 40 fawns, just for the fun of it. Okay, turn up 1,000 hertz until it's 40 dBSPL. So the guy does. Okay, now I'm going to turn up 500 hertz. You tell me when that sounds equally loud. Right there. Oh, that sounds equally loud. Okay. Remember how loud this one sounds, okay, at 1,000 hertz. Now I'm going to turn up 250 or 200. I want to turn it up, and you tell me when it sounds equally loud. And when I get to about here, you're going to say, yep, that sounds about the same loudness. And when I take 100 hertz, you tell me when that sounds equally loud to the 1,000 hertz tone here. Okay? So the 1,000 hertz tone is always the anchor. You're turning it up to some dBSPL. You're asking the guy to remember how loud that sounded psychologically, subjectively. How loud do you think that sounds? Okay. Now I'm going to turn up a 100 hertz tone. You tell me when that 100 hertz tone sounds just as loud as this 1,000 hertz tone did there. Okay? And chances are by the time I get up to 40, it doesn't sound, I have to turn it up to about 60. And now it sounds equally loud to the 1,000 hertz tone. But can you see the intensity of this is 40 dBSPL. The intensity of this is 60 dBSPL. And yet they sound equally loud. That's what I mean. There's a difference between loudness and intensity. If they were the same, you wouldn't have curves. Okay? The very fact that you have curves shows you that there's a difference between loudness and intensity. Good. Stop sharing. All right, well, don't stop sharing, just switch. So, fawns always center around 1,000 hertz. Recall unit 2, intensity in the decibel. 0 dB SPL is 0.0002 dynes per centimeter squared. This is the smallest pressure at the eardrum to just barely hear a 1000 hertz tone at 1 meter distance from a speaker with 2 ears. The loudness of all other frequencies are compared to this loudness of 1000 hertz, which was just barely audible. So look at the bottom curve first. This could be MAF or MAP. We will stick to minimal audible field. Notice the dramatic differences in dB SPL required to just barely hear all the different frequencies. That is, the thresholds for the different frequencies occur at very different intensities of dB SPL. The thresholds for all the different frequencies occur at very different dB SPLs. And yet these all sound equally loud. How loud? Just barely audible. That's how loud. Look at the top curve next. This is loudness discomfort across the frequencies. Notice how the top curve flattens out. There's less differences in dB SPL required to hear all frequencies to be uncomfortably loud. Dynamic range is the term for the area between the top and bottom Fawn curves. I'll show you. Dynamic range is the decibel distance between the bottom and the top curves. See, our football field is bigger in the middle, isn't it? It's smaller in the lows. And think about that. Let's take this tone, 50 hertz. I've got to make it about 60 dB SPL to just barely hear that sucker. Okay? It's got to be about 60 for me to just barely hear it. Whereas 1000 hertz got to be about 0 for me to just barely hear it. And yet, I can turn up 1000 hertz to 120 before it begins to hurt. And I can turn up 50 to about 125 before it begins to hurt. So what's the decibel distance between the ceiling and the floor here? 120. What's the decibel distance between the ceiling here and the floor here? About 60. Because 125 minus 65 is about 60. So my dynamic range, my decibel distance between just barely hearing it, my floor of hearing sensitivity, and the ceiling of my loudness discomfort tolerance, okay, that distance is smaller here. So one can actually say that loudness grows like a seed into a sapling into a tree. Loudness grows from infancy to adulthood to old age. It grows quicker for a smaller dynamic range. Here it's a baby, here it's an old man. Here it's a baby, and here it's an old man. Okay? It took a lot more decibels to grow from just barely audible to hurt than it did from here. At 50 hertz, it took way fewer decibels to grow from just audible to hurt. Okay? Dynamic range. And I'll stop for a second and just talk at you. Dynamic range is a big deal with hearing loss. Conductive hearing loss, problems with the outer and middle ears, is simply a plug in the ear. So if I've got a big plug in my ear, I might not be able to hear until 50 decibels. But I'll be able to tolerate about 150 because I got a plug in my ear. All I did was take that elevator box and just lift it up. The ceiling and the floor went up together. The floor of my hearing thresholds and the ceiling of my loudness tolerance, they just rose up together with conductive loss. With sensory neural loss, damage to inner hair cells and outer hair cells, okay, damage to the cochlea. If my ceiling is here, the hearing loss does this. Okay, they didn't go up and down together. The ceiling of loudness tolerance stayed the same. So if you talk to a person with hearing loss really loud, he or she's going to find that very uncomfortable, just like normal hearing is going to. Let's round off the numbers and forget about 120. Let's just say around 100 begins to sound uncomfortably loud. That's going to be uncomfortably loud to someone with presbycusis, with noise-induced hearing loss, okay, with Meniere's disease. That is going to sound the same, loud. The only difference is they can't hear till about 50. So their dynamic range goes from 50 to 100, whereas a normal dynamic range goes from 0 to 100. See? It's like me standing on the table, but the ceiling hasn't gone any taller. I just have less wiggle room. And that's why hearing aids have to amplify soft sounds by a lot, and average sounds by less, and loud sounds by little or nothing at all, because the ceiling of loudness tolerance didn't change with hearing loss. And you know what deafness is? Deafness is actually when the floor has met the ceiling. So there's no dynamic range. There's no decibel distance between threshold and pain. They can't hear anything, and as soon as they do hear it, it hurts. That's deafness. Okay? So it's all about dynamic range. Everything in this field is about dynamic range. Hearing aids are fit according to dynamic range. The listener's residual dynamic range. That's where we try and aid and put speech into the remaining area of their hearing. All right. Very good. Share screen. And here we go. I'll just go to the notes here just for the fun of it again. Yeah, boy, I'm glad you told me, Julie, that they were not up there. That's really weird. But, okay, typical. Not you, you're not weird, I'm weird. Okay, so that's what this whole paragraph here is all about. So when you do finally get your notes, put a star by that, okay? So next, look at the 40 Fawn curve. Let's look at the middle, let's look at a middle one. And when you're looking at a middle one here, there's a 40 Fawn curve. And what does it say in the notes regarding that? A 1,000 hertz tone at 40 dB SPL is heard. The listener judges its loudness, and this is called 40 Fawns. Any other frequency heard at the same loudness is also 40 Fawns. For example, a 50 hertz tone of 40 Fawns has to be over 60 dB SPL. A 50 hertz tone to be 40 Fawns has to be more than 60 dB SPL, almost downright 80. Okay? Whereas the 1,000 hertz tone, we turned it up to 40 dB SPL and asked the person to judge how loud it is. Then we took, let's say, for example, a 100 hertz tone and turned it up and said, when does that sound equally loud to the 1,000 hertz tone at 40? And it turned out to be about here. See, so again, this is just highlighting that. The curves generally flatten out as the intensity increases. The differences in dB/SPL required to hear all the different frequencies equally loud, those differences decrease as intensity increases. At low intensity level, loudness depends on physical intensity, but also quite a bit on frequency. At low intensity levels, loudness depends on the intensity, of course, but a lot on the different frequency. At intense levels, the different frequencies don't make much difference. When they're all around 120, they all sound equally loud. Okay? That's essentially the gist of it. Fawn curves and equalizers. Musicians do this a lot. People with their cars when they've got equalizers. Here's a picture of an equalizer. And you can see the different frequencies. If you go into a bar sometime and there's a band playing, there's usually someone near the back of the room with a whole bunch of instruments. And if you look closely, that person usually is adjusting an equalizer. And what that's doing is adjusting the intensity of the different frequencies so they all sound equally loud. Okay, that's an equalizer. In ghetto blasters or boom boxes, a poor man's equalizer is called a bass boost. because it doesn't work with individual frequencies. It simply boosts up the bass when the volume is soft. You got to boost up the bass. That's a poor man's equalizer, a bass boost button or a loudness switch. And you can notice if you've got the volume soft and you push the loudness button, the music sounds more full and rounded. Whereas if you don't push the button, it's kind of tinny. When you crank up the volume, you no longer need that bass boost because things are flattened out. You don't need the bass boost to make all the frequencies sound equally loud. Good, we're getting places. We'll finish today with something called sones. Sones, okay? Look again at the 40 Fawn curve. Let's look again at the 40 Fawn curve. So we've looked at whatever it takes to sound equally loud and all the things equally loud. We've beaten that dead horse. How do you say something's twice as loud as or half as loud as? Well, to do that, you have to have a ground. Just like we did with intensity. You needed a ground. You need a ground to say that the apartment is twice as tall as the house. And we did that with dBSPL. We defined our ground, and the ground was simply what was the softest pressure against my drum to hear a 1,000 hertz tone at 1 meter distance from a speaker with 2 ears, and that sound is hitting my eardrum with a real tiny pressure. How much pressure? 0.0002 dynes per centimeter squared. Okay, we'll call that pressure 0 dB sound pressure level. All right, there's our ground. That was our ground for intensity. What's going to be our ground for loudness? And that, my fine feathered friends, is the sone. The sone is the loudness of a 1,000 hertz tone at 40 dBSPL. So we circle that one. Let's do it. We go to that particular one and we circle it right here. In fact, why don't we just circle that right now? There you go. Okay? There it sits. So that's one sone. And at 40 dBSPL, that's not very loud, is it? I mean, what's ambient room noise? About 35 to 40 dBSPL. So 40 dBSPL is soft. It's audible, but it's soft. We can hear it, yeah, but it's fairly soft. What's average conversational speech? 65 to 70. So 40 is below that. 40 is even a little softer than a whisper. It's nice and soft. Okay, now where's the practical application of this? Have you ever looked at fans, air conditioners? You ever looked at stovetop fans to take the smell from your stovetop, your food, and to shoot it out, or to put it through a carbon filter or whatever it's done? You can buy cheap ones, you can buy expensive ones. Okay? The expensive ones are one sone. The cheap ones are like 3 sones. Let's say you go to the store, let's say you have an outhouse in your farmyard. And you want a cheap fan for that thing. You're going to go to some place, Lowe's or someplace, and plunk down $10 for a cheap fan. And you're going to plug it in, and it's going to go, wah. You don't care. You just want the fan to blow air. Okay? It's cheap. And because it's cheap, yeah, it works, but it's loud. And you'll see on the specs, 3 sones. I'm serious. Go to a hardware store and look at overhead stove fans when you get to the kitchen department. And if you look at the specs, the most expensive ones are like 1 sone because the fan is quiet. You turn it on, but it's barely audible. It's working the same way, but it's quiet. Okay? That's the interesting thing about sones. Sones are used to detect what's twice as loud as or half as loud as that kind of stuff. So we call the loudness of a 1000 hertz tone at 40 dB SPL, that's 40 fons, yep, but we can call that also 1 son. And a sound that sounds twice as loud as that is 2 sons. And a sound that sounds half as loud, I guess, would be half a son. A sound that sounds 4 times as loud as that would be 4 sons. Okay, that's the issue here. That's what we're trying to get at. So if we look at our notes, what does it say? Look again at the 40 fon curve. Normal hearing listener judges the loudness of a 1000 hertz tone presented at 40 dB SPL. The loudness for the tone is 40 fons. This is also called 1 son. Sons allow one to say something is twice as loud, twice as loud as, or half as loud as. For example, cheap fans are loud, so they're like 2 to 3 sons. Expensive fans would be quiet, more like 1 son. Weird, huh? All right, pitch. We won't spend long on this. I told you we'd end at sons. I was lying. Okay, let's just finish pitch and get it over with. The unit of measurement for pitch, this one's easier or has less in it, is called the mel. And let's look at it in pictures first. Take a look at the picture. As they say in Japanese, shashin wo torasete kudasai. Let me take a picture. Have a look. On the bottom is frequency. On the horizontal is perception of pitch. Okay. Again, 1000 hertz is the anchor. So let's play 1000 hertz at whatever, 60 dB SPL, a nice comfortable intensity, just normal, like conversational speech, so you can hear it easily. So you're hearing 1000 hertz. Okay, now tell me what pitch sounds twice as high. Don't tell me 2000 hertz, just tell me a frequency. Let me know when I sound twice as high in pitch. Okay, here goes. And so 1000 hertz is 1000 mels. A sound that's judged to be twice as high in pitch, not frequency, pitch, is 2000 mels. Well, let's follow what this is. If that's 2000 mels, follow it. Now, what's the frequency? Gosh, that's like 3,000 to 4,000 hertz. See? A doubling of frequency does not necessarily correlate or correspond to a doubling of pitch. See what I'm saying? Let's look at a sound that would sound twice as low in pitch. If 1000 hertz is called 1000 mels, what's a tone, what's going to sound half as high in pitch, like twice as low? 500. Well, it's going to be something like 400 hertz. Not 500. See, 500, it doesn't really meet the line. What's going to sound half as high in pitch? Okay, so you're playing a 1000 hertz tone. You're calling that pitch, the pitch of whatever you're hearing at 1000 hertz, you're calling that 1000 mels. What's going to sound half as high in pitch? That would be a sound that's 500 mels. If you find out what the frequency that corresponds to, it's actually not 500 hertz. It's lower than 500 hertz. What's going to sound twice as high in pitch? A sound that's 2000 mels. Follow the line here, and it doesn't end, the curve doesn't go past 2000 hertz. This is 2000. The curve waits until way over here. And this pitch is going to sound twice as high in frequency as 1000 hertz. Again, it's not a one-to-one. Psychology, perception is not a one-to-one thing with reality. Okay? The objective measures, our bodies kind of bastardize sound. We're not machines. We're humans. We have perceptions. And so that's why psychoacoustics is such an important thing to acknowledge this way. And we don't get into this stuff very much. This is research. We don't care that much about it. And the only way Solens relates to you and me is talking about loudness of fans or air conditioners. That's about it. And equal loudness contours is kind of an intellectual exercise. You don't find hearing aid dealers and HISs all throughout the United States talking about equal loudness contours. But it's part of a good, well-rounded education in acoustics to realize that psychoacoustics, that threshold, is actually very different across the frequencies. We hear some frequencies better than we hear other frequencies. And we draw the line of 0 dBHL as a flat line on the audiogram. But in reality, if you took off the veneer, you'd find out that actually 0 dBHL at 1,000 hertz is actually about 7. In other words, if I go to here, and 0 dB at 500 hertz is actually about 17, maybe 15. And 0 dB at 250 hertz is actually about 30. And 0 dB at 125 hertz is actually about 40. Because remember, MAP is 0 dBHL. Think about 4 chapters. Remember from last week, this is chapter 1. It defines 0 dB SPL. The softest it took to hear a 1,000 hertz tone at 1 meter distance from a speaker with 2 ears. Chapter 2, same game, other frequencies. Chapter 3, MAP, same game, but with 1 ear under a headphone. Chapter 4, let's call MAP 0 dBHL. And then today we carried on from that, and we talked about equal loudness contours, the FON being the unit for loudness, and the MEL being the unit for pitch. And if you look in your notes here, subjective perception of frequency. In general, the higher the frequency, the higher our pitch perception. Duh. Pitch depends mostly on frequency, but also a little bit on intensity and duration. No, don't worry about that. A doubling of octave frequency does not necessarily correspond to an exact doubling of pitch perception. The MEL is the unit for pitch perception. 1,000 MELs is a pitch of 1,000 hertz tone at 40 dB SPL. 2,000 MELs, a tone that sounds twice as high in pitch. 500 MELs, a tone that sounds twice as low. Note that 2,000 MELs is actually around 1,500 hertz, not 2,000 hertz. 500 MELs is actually closer to 400 hertz, not 500 hertz. So, this is kind of weird, 1,500 hertz. Let's follow that for a second here. And then I'll get out of here. 2,000 MELs. Yeah, you're right. Okay, so here's frequency. 2,000 hertz is actually 1,500 MELs. See, 1,000 hertz, we call that 1,000 MELs. If you took 2,000 hertz, that doesn't sound twice as high because it only sounds about 1.5 times as high. To be 2,000 MELs, to actually sound twice as high, the tone would need to be around 3,000 to 4,000 hertz. So we'll end with that, okay? Basically, we've covered page 1 and the very top of page 2. And now I will upload the notes and the PowerPoint to Unit 5 in 110 Canvas. Thank you, Julie, for letting me know about my weird transgression. I will stop sharing here, and I'll stop recording here. And we'll see you next week.